I love showing somebody how to use their camera, basically covering some of the most essential camera settings for getting started, and then watching them go off into the world and encounter problem after problem after problem. And so much of photography really is learning some of the basics and then just going off into the real world and kind of watching it all crumble, trying to do something and it isn't working out, but then you figure out how to fine tune things so that you can make it work. So here I have some questions about raw photos and some stuff that went wrong at a beach. And so I'm just gonna kind of troubleshoot this, walk through this, and give some advice that will hopefully help next time you're in this kind of situation. So this person, Mercedes, she photographed a couple of friends at a beach, and she went with shooting RAW and JPEG. So you can either shoot in JPEG, which is just a normal picture file, or RAW, and I have videos explaining this, so if you're not sure about this, go check them out. Or you can shoot in RAW plus JPEG, so that you actually keep two copies of the photo. And the reason why you would do this is because you think you might run into trouble with lighting, and you might have to really do some extra editing to your photos because the lighting situation is so tricky, which we're going to see in a second. And so then you think, well, let's keep both files, because maybe for 9 out of 10 photos the JPEG file is just fine. You can do some edits to it, but there's that one picture in 10 where you need some extra flexibility, and the RAW will give you the extra flexibility, maybe saving what would have been a ruined photo. So she was out there and doing this. A lot of her photos were overexposed. She couldn't figure out how to fix this at the beach. Like, how do I take this picture properly versus having to edit the photo later? And when she compared both the RAW and JPEG photo side by side, the RAW photo seemed way brighter than the JPEG. They looked like two different exposed photos. It was the same photo, but why did the files look so different? And it's because the JPEG file is an edited file. This has been processed, edited by your camera, whereas the RAW file has not been processed by your camera. It's just sitting there waiting for somebody to do something with it to make it look better. So that's why the RAW file, sometimes they look a lot darker than the JPEG, sometimes they look a lot brighter, sometimes they look very similar. Just the colors are kind of flat, not very vibrant and whatnot. And that's okay. So yes, that's normal. She wants to know, do I always shoot in RAW or only sometimes? Because she finds it annoying to sort through photos. She's got 2 copies of each. She doesn't need them both. And that can be really annoying when it comes to the sorting. And okay, I normally don't shoot RAW and JPEG. I used to when I first started, and that's why I would recommend to people, if they're starting to get into RAW, go ahead and shoot RAW and JPEG at first, till you get used to it, till you can see the difference, till you know when you should shoot JPEG and when you should shoot RAW from experience. Just keep shooting both. And I mean, it's okay if you have photos that aren't all that important to you, you're just going out and practicing or whatever, then go ahead and pick just RAW or JPEG. Or if you want to experiment with RAW, just go with RAW. But if you feel like the photos are important at all, I would say shoot both, because the JPEGs may be just fine, but like I say, 1 in 10 or 1 in 100, you wish you had that RAW file. We're going to see in a second where that's going to come into play. So if it really annoys you, then just shoot one or the other. The other thing is, when you take your photos off the camera card and put them on your computer, often what I do is I make a folder for JPEG and a folder for RAW, and then I only import, let's say, the JPEG photos into Lightroom. And then the RAW photos are there. If I need to go find 1 or 2 of them, they're there. But if I don't need them, then later I just delete them and they're gone. So I separate them to begin with, and then if I really don't need them, I delete them. And if I need 1 or 2, then I keep them. Lately, I've just been shooting RAW only. That's what I've been doing. I upgraded my camera, and I just prefer the RAW photo experience. It's been working for me. I've been happy with it. So that's what I've been going with. Okay, and then finally, should I be editing the RAW photos even though they are more overexposed? What I would say is obviously don't touch the RAW file if the JPEG is fine and you just need to do some tiny minor little edits. But don't be intimidated by a RAW file that looks like junk or overexposed or whatever, because as we're about to see, there's a lot of power in a RAW file. So this first photo is really overexposed. You'll have to forgive my brand new computer and how slow it's going. It's a brand new computer, so of course it's going slower than my old one. Some of these images will take a few seconds to load. So this one is really overexposed, and here's what we can do with a RAW file. If this was JPEG, there isn't much you could do to salvage the brightest parts of this photo. Okay, so the brightest parts of this photo are in around her face, legs down here, face over here, a bit of the arm, and it's just sort of where the light is hitting most intensely. So if this was a JPEG file, I think that this is too overexposed to fix it. I'm going to show you how to fix it with RAW, and it might not quite work entirely, but we're basically just going to take the highlight slider and go all the way down. And so here's before. Here is yeah, there we go. There's before, and then we'll bring it back again. So you can see that even with this RAW file, it is still overexposed. It got a little bit too bright. So Mercedes and I were talking later, and she thinks, at least I think this is a situation here, where she may have actually left her exposure compensation on like +2 or something like that, or +3. And so what was happening was she had been in a situation where the photos were turning out kind of dull, and so she bumped it up to like +2 or something like that, and then she was getting good photos. But then later on, she forgot that she was on +2 or 3 or whatever, and was taking these photos. And so the camera was taking, going for the exposure it thought was right, but then bumping it up way brighter because she said go to +3. And I think that's what was happening here. It's just about the only explanation for why she's in aperture mode, but why is the photo coming out so bright? And so there we go. Now we can see over here. So this photo didn't look so bad. And let me just double check that this is a RAW file. And so, but it is a bit overexposed. You can see the whiteness in the background and along their hair a little bit. And so, again, we're basically going to use the shadow slider. So hair in around here and even in around here is a little overexposed. And so, but this photo isn't all that bad, because here's the reality is, okay, she's in a backlit situation. The sun is way up here somewhere and is shining into the scene. It's hitting their shoulders and their hair and stuff like that. It's lighting up the water and the rocks in the background. And that's really, really bright. And then Mercedes is standing over on the shady side of the people. So these people are all actually shaded. And now you want to try and get a photo where everything looks good. You're offering your camera some deep shade, but you're also offering your camera really bright light. And that's just tough. It's really hard for your camera to get both of them right. It's basically not going to get them both right. So again, we can just go with the highlight slider over here, and you see the highlights go darker. So I'll undo it, and we'll see everything get bright again, a little too bright, and then that's with the highlights down. Now, there's still the girl in the black dress. Her hair is still a little overexposed. You can see the sun hitting it. It's not necessarily that big of a deal. I mean, I see this a lot in photos, and if that's If that's how it is, that's how it is. Sometimes when you get that the light hitting the edge of something, sometimes it does get a little overexposed. Now, if Mercedes was still dealing with the same problem of forgetting her exposure compensation on +3, then that's why this photo is kind of so bright. If she had just been on +1, because when you're standing on the shady side of people, you usually do need to bump up the exposure a little bit. Say she had only been on +1 and the photo would have originally looked, I'm just simulating it here, but it would have looked a little bit more like that, and you probably wouldn't have quite overexposed the hair. And so it's kind of going for a happy medium where you brighten the photo a little bit so that the people look decent, but then in editing you would come in and kind of like bump up the shadows, and that would sort of help a little bit. Again, I'm kind of trying to simulate a different photo here, but let's move on. So here are some situations, especially one like this, where she tried to do a portrait, and look how dark the girl is in the photo and how bright the water is. And so again, this is just a more extreme version of the last photo we saw, where basically your camera is struggling to deal with the intense bright sunlight and then also standing on the shady side of the person. I know our eye sees this scenario completely different. Our eye sees things very normal. It can balance things out, but our camera is not as powerful as our eye. So you've got this intense bright light here telling the camera to, to darken down the photo a little bit so it looks nice. And as a landscape, that would look really nice. But there's a person in the landscape. And when you're on the shady side of the person, they're going to look very dark. You almost have a silhouette here. Not a perfect silhouette, but you've got something like that. So if you are in this situation, I mean, it's tough. It is just a tough situation to get a good portrait. So if you come home with a photo like this, if it's a JPEG, you're not going to have as much flexibility in editing. But look what happens if it's a RAW file like this one. You take the shadows and you brighten them, and all of a sudden that person is like normal brightness. Now, their skin tones and stuff seem to be a little bit off, and so we can figure out if there's something that we can do with that. But at least she's brighter now. And, going all the way up to 100 in brightness is not necessarily ideal. But again, we're dealing with a photo here that we kind of have to rescue. And then you could also take the highlights down, and then, now everything is a lot more even looking. Maybe you don't necessarily want to take the highlights all the way down, but a little bit down. And notice, we're never really going to rescue the overexposed part in the water, this area in here, because it's just so, and even the sun, is just so intensely bright that the camera just couldn't capture it. And it is a little bit overexposed. And like I say, sometimes you get highlights like that reflecting on something that will be a little overexposed. Her hair looks decent though. So, okay, what do we do here? On the one hand, I'm wondering if we should, I think the colors look pretty decent, but I'm just wondering, see, if we warm up the photo a little bit, I kind of think it looks nice with the water, but now her skin is looking a little bit off. So I don't know. I don't know what I would try and do here. I might just live with the color that we've got. Oh, one thing, your camera has different color profiles. So because we are using a RAW file, we can access all these profiles within Lightroom. And so I might actually click on Portrait and see what it does. Now I think that's Portrait, and then let's go off Portrait. Yeah, doesn't that really improve her skin tones right there? And so when you set the color for Portrait, that's what it does, is it favors skin tones. And just as an example, let's, oops, did I hit landscape? Yeah, okay, we're back on Portrait. Nope. There, now we're on Portrait. And then, okay, let's go to Vivid, and then notice what it does to her skin tones. It gets like really red and vibrant, looking like she has a suntan. And that's what happens when you make the colors vivid. So for portraits, you usually don't want as vivid tones. So that right there might have rescued this photo. Let's go back and see where we started with this photo. We started right there with a photo like that, and then we ended up, with this. So, you know, I would say that's pretty good, and that's kind of the power of RAW, to bring back some of those details in the highlights and shadows that would have been locked and frozen and lost in a JPEG photo. And then, okay, so here is a photo that Mercedes edited. So I would say, you know, did a pretty good job as an edit. And so I'm just going to take a quick crack at it here with the RAW file. And so, again, you can bring the highlights down, and that rescues some of the over brightness of the water. And then you can bring the shadows up, and that is going to help bring back some of the details in the person. Now, I would say that this photo looks fairly cool, like fairly bluish, and at golden hour, you would expect it to look a lot warmer. So I'm going to take the warmth up to like 6,000, and that probably looks more realistic there. The skin tones look more realistic. Now, you might notice because we brought those shadows up so bright, there is some graininess in the photo there. When you look at her dress, you can see that. And one way to help combat that graininess is to bump up your noise reduction. And now it helps to get rid of the graininess. It softens the grain, but it kind of softens the photo in general. So as long as you're okay with the look of it, then a little bit of noise reduction is helpful. All right, we've got some, obviously, like with this photo here, both of these definitely very overexposed skin. Now, you can pay more attention in the moment and figuring out if you're getting overexposed photos or not. So here's a couple of tips for that. Basically, you need to activate your histogram on the camera. And I'll show you what the histogram is, give you a really brief explanation, but I've explained it in another video. So this is the histogram here. I'm looking at it in Lightroom while I edit, but you can also see it on your camera after you've taken a picture. And mirrorless cameras actually let you see the histogram while you're taking a picture, like before you take the picture. But anyway, so you can snap a photo and you can activate your histogram, and everything on this side of the histogram is very dark. If it's right up against the edge, it's black, and everything on this side is bright, and if it's right up against the edge like this is over here, then it's bright. It's basically like white, and then everything here is basically in between. And so in this photo, let me get rid of those marks, we can look at her skin and see clearly that it's overexposed. But when you're taking pictures and you're out in bright light and it's hard to see the back of your camera, it's hard to tell if that skin is overexposed or not. So if you activate the histogram, anytime you get this big spike right off on the side and it's bordered right up on the edge over here, it's telling you that there are a lot of really bright spots and bright pixels, even white pixels. And once a pixel turns white, it's overexposed and there's nothing really that you can do about it to rescue it. It's just, if you darken it, it's just going to look dull and gray looking. So if in the moment when you're photographing, if you activate the histogram, Mercedes would have known that this photo was overexposed. She didn't need to wait till she got home. The histogram would show her that. If you want to learn more about the histogram, check out the video on that. Now again, we're going to go through the same process here with overexposed parts of the photo. We're going to drag down the highlights, and notice most of the detail in the skin comes back. It's just her headband that is left overexposed. We've done what we can with highlights, with the highlight slider. Now we could pull out our brush and do like another layer of darkening the highlights. And this is a trick I learned where let me just adjust the size of my brush. And I'm just doing this really quick here. I'm not going for detail or perfection, but you can brush over something. Actually, okay, I got rid of the highlight, what I did with the slider, and we're back to our normal photo. So watch what happens when we brush over this. We're darkening, all we're doing with our brush is darkening the highlights. So you can see that I opened the brush and then darkened the highlights. Now, that did everything it could. But what you can do is make another brush and darken the highlights again. And you see them, it's pretty subtle, but they are going a little bit darker. And basically what I'm trying to do is get all the detail back in the skin. And so this I would say the skin still looks, somewhat bright. So we've gone over it twice with the brush. Now I can go back to the slider here and darken it again, just a little bit more. So that's before the slider, that's with the slider. So doing like multiple layers of bringing down the highlights is sometimes helpful. And then if we still felt that the overall photo was too bright, we can then use our exposure adjustment. I don't know, maybe something like that. So that was a pretty overexposed photo, and we were able to get back most of the detail in the skin. What I would like to do is soften the photo a little bit by bringing the clarity down, maybe to like 20 or something like that. And it'll kind of soften out some of the skin there. Now, I don't think we ever quite got back the detail in her headband, but kind of most of it, some of it anyways. So there's basically what I've gone over is techniques for when you have a raw file and it's a little overexposed, you're really going to focus on the highlight slider. And when you have some underexposed parts of it, then you're going to focus on the shadow slider. And there's definitely a lot of value in a raw file. Again, check out the other videos on that, and you'll see the power in it. So this is life. This is troubleshooting with photography. This is learning the basic camera settings. So Mercedes is focusing on setting her ISO and then being in aperture mode and controlling the aperture and using the plus minus button when she goes, oops, that photo's too bright, she goes to -1 or whatever. Oops, that photo's too dark, she goes to +2 or whatever it may be. And then don't forget to set it back to 0 when you're done taking pictures. And yes, you are going to run into these difficult situations where you offer your camera darkness and brightness and it doesn't know how to balance those out. And you kind of do the best you can in the moment. And then when you get home, especially if you have a raw file, you drop those highlights down a bit and you bring those shadows up and you go into your different color modes. And again, if you were shooting raw, you have access to these. And then maybe you go click on portrait and that cleans up the color a little bit. You can drop the blacks down a bit to bring back a little contrast. And you go down to your noise reduction and you bump that up as much as you are willing to. And there we go. You can play around with the colors and whatnot from there. But this is photography life. It's getting yourself into getting yourself some basic knowledge, going out into the hardest situations possible, and then working your way out step by step and going back to that beach every night or every week until you get it right, until you go, okay, now I know what's going on. I can face all the most difficult problems and I figure them out. It takes a little while, but you'll get there.